The Battle of Little Bighorn ends, and the horror unfolds. Custer untouched, almost sleeping, but his kin mangled beyond recognition. Arrows bent in flesh, scalps lifted. Pockets yield paper money for kids' play, whiskey for the victors, while bodies bleach marble white under Montana sun. Sioux warriors didn't just win. They dismantled the myth, heads lopped, dragged through villages, burned at stakes. A paradox of triumph and terror, like a blockbuster flop where the underdogs rewrite the script with blood, leaving history to pick up the pieces. The sun hung low over the Little Bighorn Valley as the echoes of gunfire faded into the Montana wind. On the 25th of June, 1876, 5 companies of the U.S. 7th Cavalry, led directly by George Armstrong Custer, had been utterly annihilated by a coalition of Lakota Sioux, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho warriors. What followed wasn't a tidy retreat or a solemn truce, it was a sweep of the battlefield by the victors, who viewed the fallen not just as enemies but as sources of practical spoils. Warriors like White Wolf, a Cheyenne participant, later recounted how young men descended on the bodies, rifling through pockets with the efficiency of frontier scavengers. This wasn't mindless vandalism, it was a cultural extension of warfare, where taking from the defeated affirmed survival in a world where resources were scarce and every item could mean the difference between thriving and starving. In the native worldview, the battle's end marked not closure but a redistribution, turning the tools of the invaders against their own legacy. Among the discoveries were stacks of square green paper money, crisp and foreign to the warriors who had no use for such currency in their nomadic economy. White Wolf described how these bills, pulled from the soldiers' blue uniforms, ended up in the hands of children back in the village. The kids fashioned them into miniature saddle blankets for their mud horse toys, a poignant repurposing that transformed symbols of American expansion into playthings under teepee floors. It was as if the paper promises of manifest destiny dissolved into child's play, much like how today's digital fortunes can vanish in a market crash, leaving only memes in their wake. Silver coins, more tangible and malleable, fared differently. Cheyenne artisans hammered them into buckles for belts and adornments, embedding the metal into daily life as subtle trophies. This looting extended beyond currency to personal effects, with warriors like Wooden Leg, Little Hawk, and Bobtail Horse reporting bottles of whiskey tucked into the saddlebags or pockets of the dead. The alcohol, a vice the cavalry carried into battle, now fueled victory celebrations, an ironic twist where the invaders' indulgences became the natives' brief luxuries amid the chaos. Yet the aftermath grew darker as the warriors processed their triumph through rituals that outsiders would label barbaric, but which held deep cultural significance for the Lakota and Cheyenne. George Herendeen, a scout with the 7th Cavalry who survived by hiding in the brush, later reported stumbling upon the heads of 4 white soldiers in a Sioux camp, severed cleanly from their trunks. These grisly finds, detached and displayed, underscored the mutilation practices rooted in spiritual beliefs, mutilating bodies to hinder enemies in the afterlife, ensuring they couldn't pursue the living as spirits. The corresponding bodies remained absent from the battlefield or village, swallowed by the terrain or perhaps dragged away for further rites. Lieutenant Charles Varnum echoed this horror, describing a white man's head found in the village with a rope lasso knotted around it, evidence it had been dragged in loops until the neck gave way. Such acts weren't random cruelty. They were statements of dominance, echoing ancient warrior traditions where physical disfigurement mirrored the psychological defeat inflicted on the U.S. forces. Survivor accounts added layers to this reckoning, painting a picture of calculated vengeance. Jacob Adams, another who evaded death, detailed how some soldiers were lassoed straight from their horses mid-flight and hauled to the village center. There, in full view of any remaining comrades pinned down nearby, they were bound to trees and set ablaze that night. The flames lit the darkening sky, a spectacle that must have frozen the blood of Reno's and Benteen's men, who watched helplessly from afar, unable to intervene without risking their own annihilation. This wasn't mere execution, it was theater, a live demonstration of the consequences for encroaching on sacred lands, akin to a 19th century viral warning shot across the bow of American ambition. John Ryan, part of the burial detail days later, confirmed the remnants. Scattered human bones mingled with shreds of blue uniforms at the sites of these stakes and trees, silent witnesses to the pyres that consumed the captives. In this immediate sweep, the native warriors didn't just claim victory. They deconstructed the myth of cavalry invincibility, piece by looted piece. The battlefield, once a stage for Custer's glory, became a workshop for repurposing defeat into utility and ritual. Whiskey bottles clinked in saddlebags headed back to camp, greenbacks fluttered in children's games, and silver gleamed on new buckles, all while the severed remains served as stark reminders of the cost. This phase, raw and unfiltered, set the tone for the days ahead, where triumph mingled with the practicalities of war's cleanup, leaving the valley etched with a narrative that history would struggle to sanitize. 2 days after the clash, on the 27th of June, 1876, the remnants of the 7th Cavalry, under Reno and Benteen, crested the ridges and gazed upon the ruins of Little Bighorn. What they encountered wasn't a fresh battlefield but a sun-baked tableau of decay, where the Montana heat had already begun its indifferent work on the fallen. Lieutenant Edward S. Godfrey, riding at the front, captured the scene in reports that read like dispatches from a forgotten war zone. Marble white bodies sprawled across the field, their pallor a stark contrast to the somber brown hides of dead horses dotting the landscape. Foals, too young for battle but caught in its wake, lay crumpled nearby, adding a layer of unintended pathos to the carnage. Godfrey noted how the thickest clusters of dead centered on and around Custer Hill, where the final desperate stand had unraveled into slaughter. This wasn't the heroic tableau painted in later engravings, it was a scattershot graveyard, bodies twisted in the positions of their last breaths, rifles scattered like discarded props from a play gone horribly wrong. The terrain amplified the desolation, with tufts of reddish-brown grass clinging to soil so ashy white it resembled the aftermath of a prairie fire. Godfrey described it as a lonely, desolate sight that weighed heavy on the heart in grief, a landscape that seemed engineered to mock the ambitions of the men who had charged into it. In his words, he could never forget the sight, a sentiment echoed by survivors who rode through it like ghosts surveying their own potential fate. Think of it as stumbling upon a 19th-century crime scene. No yellow tape, just the wind whispering over evidence that the cavalry's bold push had backfired spectacularly, leaving only silence and the faint buzz of flies to greet the discoverers. As the cavalry picked through the debris on the 27th of June, 1876, the task shifted from survey to grim identification, revealing how the warriors had treated their foes with a mix of precision and fury. Captain Tom Custer, the general's brother, was located near the hill's crest, north of his sibling by just a few yards, face down in the dirt. His features were pressed out of shape, almost beyond recognition, a testament to the close-quarters chaos that ended him. Multiple arrows pierced his back, several more lodged in his head. One stood out, shaftless. Its head bent so severely it resisted extraction, embedded like a final, stubborn accusation. His skull was crushed, and nearly all his hair scalped away except a small patch at the nape, leaving him a mangled shadow of the decorated officer he had been. This wasn't random. It spoke to the warrior's intent to dismantle not just lives but legacies, turning a family man into an unrecognizable relic under the open sky. In stark contrast, General George Armstrong Custer himself escaped mutilation entirely. He lay on his back, arms at his sides, hands folded and crossed over his body above the stomach, a pose so natural it mirrored the catnaps he'd taken during countless marches. Observers noted it was one they'd seen hundreds of times, a mundane detail that humanized the myth in death. His wounds were clean, one to the front of the left temple, another in the left breast near the heart, suggesting a swift end amid the frenzy. No scalping, no disfigurement, just the quiet repose of a man who had ridden into legend only to exit it abruptly. This selective mercy, or perhaps oversight, added an ironic layer. The face of the campaign lay untouched, while those around him bore the full weight of vengeance, like a director sparing the lead actor while decimating the supporting cast. Boston Custer, the youngest brother, was found about 200 yards from Custer Hill, stripped bare except for his white cotton socks, from which the name had been meticulously cut out. This pattern repeated across the field. Any undergarment or sock bearing a bloodied name had it excised, a deliberate erasure that stripped identities along with clothes. The naked, mutilated bodies, riddled with bloody fatal wounds, were nearly unrecognizable, forming a scene of sickening, ghastly horror that seared into the minds of the living. Trumpeter Giovanni Martini, scouting the area, spotted a heap of dead men piled in a deep ravine between Custer's position and the river, a mass grave dug by gravity and desperation. Among the details, one senior sergeant, entrusted with soldiers' pay, had about $500 in paper money torn and scattered over his corpse, a feudal fortune reduced to confetti in the wind. Martini also observed that one of Adjutant William Cook's sideburns had been scalped off, skin and all, a peculiar trophy that highlighted the personal, almost artistic touches in the warrior's work. These observations painted a mosaic of defeat. Brothers scattered, fortunes wasted, features stolen. In the native tradition, such acts prevented spirits from whole passage, but to the cavalry, it was a desecration that amplified the loss. Like auditing a failed startup in 1876 terms, the inventory revealed overconfidence's true cost, bodies cataloged not by valor but by the extent of their undoing, leaving the survivors to ponder how a family's ambition ended in such fragmented anonymity. The discovery phase gave way to the grim mechanics of cleanup, where the cavalry's limited arsenal turned a battlefield into a makeshift cemetery under the relentless sun. With perhaps a half-dozen spades and shovels, as many axes, a couple of picks, and a few hatchets scattered across the entire command, the survivors faced an impossible task. These weren't the tools of gravediggers but of soldiers caught in the aftermath, scraping together whatever could break the baked earth. Knives and tin cups joined the effort, makeshift scoops for piling thin layers of soil over the bodies where they fell. It was less a burial than a token gesture, a scant covering from Mother Earth that barely hid the horror, like throwing a sheet over a mess and calling it cleaned. In the vast Montana wilderness, hundreds of miles from civilization, friends, or home, they left the dead to the wolves, a practical surrender to nature's recyclers that underscored how far ambition had stranded them. This wasn't the dignified interment of war heroes, it was a hurried concession to decay, with the living prioritizing their own retreat over rituals. Think of it as a 19th century version of minimal viable cleanup, where resources dictated shallow graves and the wind carried away any illusions of closure. The men worked in silence, the weight of the task etching deeper lines than the battle itself, knowing that coyotes and crows would soon undo their efforts. In that desolate valley, the burial became another layer of irony, the cavalry's final act, not of conquest but of quiet abandonment, leaving bones to bleach as silent markers of overreach. Amid the chaos of Custer's last stand, symbols of military pride met undignified ends, with the 5 guidons carried by his companies vanishing into the fray except for one poignant survivor. These swallow-tailed flags, emblems of unit cohesion in the swirling dust, were prime targets for warriors who saw them as trophies of disruption. Only one was recovered immediately, tucked beneath the body of Corporal John Foley, who had clutched it in a desperate bid for escape. Foley spurred his horse away from the hill, guidon in hand. But the pursuing natives closed in relentlessly. Before they could capture him alive, he turned his revolver on himself, a self-inflicted shot to the head that preserved his dignity in death, if not his life. The flag, stained and hidden under his fallen form, escaped the initial looting. A small artifact spared the flames or shredding that claimed its counterparts. This act of defiance echoed the broader futility, like a last-minute save in a game already lost, where one man's choice denied the victors a living prize. The guidon earned its name from Sergeant Ferdinand Culbertson, part of the burial detail that unearthed it days later, transforming a battlefield relic into a named piece of history. Culbertson, scanning the carnage, spotted the flag's edge peeking from under Foley, pulling it free as a somber keepsake amid the shallow graves. Over time, this Culbertson guidon became more than cloth. It symbolized the narrow escapes woven into the slaughter, preserved through decades until its auction at Sotheby's in 2010. Sold to a private collector for $2.2 million, it fetched a price that reflected its rarity, turning a bloodied banner into a high-stakes collectible. In the modern market, it's akin to bidding on a glitch in the matrix of American myth, where defeat's debris commands fortunes while the bones it once flew over remain anonymous in the soil. Custer's men lay scattered, looted, and shallowly buried, their defeat a mosaic of native ingenuity and cavalry hubris at Little Bighorn. Warriors repurposed spoils, while symbols like the guidon whispered of individual ends amid collective ruin. History reflects this as a turning point, where overconfidence clashed with resolve, leaving echoes that question expansion's cost without easy answers. Hit subscribe on Native Legends and History Stories for more unflinching tales, and drop your thoughts below.